Yo, Danny with the DMGT here, your new favorite place for all things music, gaming, and tech. I always say music first, and I don't make enough music content, so here's my list of best albums of the year so far. If you've been watching any of my YouTube shorts where I'm reviewing video game OSTs, or the ones where I'm highlighting video game collaborations with artists, here's basically my video to show you that I do have some solid music chops to prove to no one really, but just here we go. Also, Anthony Fantano follows us on TikTok, so there's some proof. Alright, let's start off with a band that is flying a little bit under the radar. Not really, they have a decent following online. But Hot Mulligan's Why Would I Watch? If you are a fan of like Midwest emo and pop punk and a little bit of just straight up punk, they find themselves somewhere in the middle of that triangle and it works really well. Although they self-describe as post-emo. The lyricism and vocal work is pretty raw. The guitar work I think works really well. The production work here I think is pretty tight, but it's not overdone. There's still a little bit of roughness around the edges, which I think is good for this type of music. It just comes across very genuine, which is what you need in this genre. So if you just want to like rock out and get into your feels a little bit, this is a good album. Go check it out. boygenius, the record. Obviously, this is a supergroup with the likes of Phoebe Bridgers, Lucy Dacus, and Julian Baker. They are all very strong singer-songwriters in their own right, but they're really in the zone with this record. Another one that's kind of in their feelings, it's kind of sad throughout, but it's also musically very vibey. That's a terrible description, but it's like low-tempo rock and roll with like a smidge of folk in there, a lot of really cool vocal work. It's not over the top in its lyrical density. They obviously have things to say here, but you can also just kind of throw this on the background and just like have a good time. Speaking of lyrically dense, Killer Mike's Michael. It's very introspective, but it still hits hard. I'm always a big fan of a rap and hip-hop album that just like hits hard on the production. You can really thump this while keeping lyrical density and substance without going overly into the lyrical miracle realm. Although the lyrical notes don't really stick the landing like they do in the past, where it's a little bit more relatable. Obviously, Killer Mike's now speaking from a perspective where he's gathered wealth and success. It's kind of similar to Beyonce's Renaissance in some aspects where it's not as approachable, but it still bumps. And anytime you can bring out Andre 3000 for any type of work, I'm in. Andre, please give us an album. Yaeji with a Hammer. This is technically her first major record debut, although she's been making music since 2016, and 2017's EP2 is the one that really popped off. This album is cool in like a very eccentric and ambient type of way. There's some really cool and quirky jazz and synth work in this production, and then it's cut with an undercurrent of like rage and anger, even though the songs sound very like open and poppy. It's a really cool listen and probably has the biggest soundscape of any album on this list. It's fun production wise, I recommend it. And then speaking of having fun with production, Danny Brown and JPEGMAFIA Scaring the Hoes. Thematically, this one's not that dissimilar from Killer Mike's album, but it does handle the anti-sanctimony sentiments a little bit better, I think. The back and forth between JPEGMAFIA and Danny Brown is really fun. It feels like they have a solid 50-50 split on the lyrical content. And look, I understand that the production and the mix here is sort of intentionally rough, but it just feels like at times Danny Brown and JPEGMAFIA's vocal work is like fighting with the track. Distortion can work, but it feels like it's clipping at times, and I guess really I'm just mad that I can't bump this in the car without completely blowing out my speakers. Again, to be fair, that is the point. It's weird in the best ways possible. This is a good listen. Kara Jackson, Why Does the Earth Give Us People to Love? Imagine if you took the boygenius record and stripped it down a little bit further and incorporated a little bit more folk into it. That's what this album is. It's really sad, but there's some really cool vocal work here. The guitar work is done really well. There is some other production. It's not just vocals and guitar, but at its core, it's very raw, very emotional, very moody. Folk music can already be a little bit minimalistic, but this one takes it a step further. It's a good listen. Potentially the best songwriting and lyricism of the list here so far. Shout out to the Chicago-based singer-songwriter. Paramore, This Is Why. Honestly, it's kind of impressive that a band that has been around as long as Paramore is still dropping really good albums, and not in like a I doubt their talent type of way. It's more that bands of this legacy tend to start falling off at this point in their career, and Paramore is not. Despite the success that they've had so far, the music in this album still carries a lot of oomph. It has a lot of power behind it. Like After Laughter, this one still has a lot of poppiness to it, but they incorporate a little bit more punk into it, a little bit more edginess and rawness on the music production side. So there's some genuine rawness and visceralness to this. Obviously, Hayley Williams' lyrical work and vocal work is still very good. It's not overproduced, and while this one had to grow on me a little bit, it continues to grow and made it to the list. Adjy, June Songs Volume 1. This is a band that is very, very under the radar. We're talking less than 5,000 monthly listeners on Spotify. And while this is technically an EP, I'm going to add it to this list because, trust me, this is an incredible listen. The songwriting is tight and poetic. It can get a little grandiose, but if you're a fan of the folky, emo music that I kind of mentioned with Hot Mulligan, but a little bit more down-tempo, believe me, you need to check out this project. This is another emotive listen, but it's more of a soft summer love feel. It's a little bit more happy-go-lucky without being overly preachy. And don't let that description fool you, because the instrumentation is is actually really complex. For example, the drum work doesn't go quite as mathy as 2021's The Idol Opus, but it retains a lot of that core and makes it a little bit more approachable, so before you dive into some of their more complex work, this is a really good introduction. Their songwriting is very like a story in music format, more so than most projects are, but I'm a big fan, so please go check this out before, again, you dive into some of their earlier work, because this is a really good, underrated band. Okay, so everything has been sort of in no particular order except for these last two albums, but Caroline Polachek's Desire I Want to Turn Into You is my current runner-up for album of the year. And if it ends up being like your best album or your favorite album of the year, I'd say you're probably right. This is like a velvety, smooth pop record with some really fun synth work. The vocal work here and lyricism is kind of introspective as well, but it works really well. And it all just comes together to create a very pleasant ambiance that is both upbeat and ethereal at the same time. Okay, that description is a little bit obnoxious, I know, but it's accurate. There are some down-tempo tracks on this album, and it's not quite as lyrically dense as like a boygenius record, but there is still substance here. It just has a nice balance of depth and poppiness. I think when most people think of a best pop album of the year, it's a little bit more in your face, and this one's not exactly that. Although you can still definitely thump this in your car, and you should go for a nighttime drive, and it's gonna be a good time. Again, I'm a big fan. This almost was my number one. But my current album of the year is Lil Yachty's Let's Start Here. Look, I don't really care if it's derivative or too similar to Dark Side of the Moon, or if other bands maybe do this genre better. Anytime an artist comes out of left field and makes a record this good and does the genre justice, I'm always going to be a fan. And this isn't like in a snobby, oh, I didn't like Lil Yachty's previous work, but this is actually good music. No, I'm a fan of Lil Yachty. I've enjoyed most of his music since he blew up on the scene. But this record does psychedelic rock justice. It still feels unique in its own way. It feels refreshing, and anytime an artist can introduce this type of music to their fans that maybe wouldn't have been exposed to this or open to listening to this type of music, it's always a positive thing in my opinion. Lil Yachty has some really good vocal work here. The instrumentation is really cool. There's definitely room for improvement here, but like I mentioned earlier, it does this genre justice. I truly believe that. And when you think about it, in the last 10 years, how many albums are really pulling this type of inspiration in their music? Not a lot, so this one deserves more credit than it's getting, and it's already getting a ton of hype. So that's what's making this my current favorite album of the year. Of course, this is just a mid-year check-in, so I imagine this list is probably going to change rather significantly by the end of the year. I think we haven't gotten like a big hard-hitting summer bop yet. Kind of waiting on that, even though we're like in the middle of the summer right now. But I feel like the fall and early winter is also a good time where some really strong albums start coming out before the end of the year. So we'll see, but obviously I'll do an end of the year best albums of 2023 at some point in December, early January. Let me know what your favorite albums of the year so far are. Did you like any of my recommendations? And hopefully I have proven my music listening chops, that is both some mainstream popular stuff that you may have heard of with some things that maybe you haven't heard of yet. Okay, I'm going to finish this Final Fantasy 16 review. I promise that's coming next week. I think it falls just short of greatness if you saw my 2023 mid-year best games video. I'll get into a little bit more details because I have a lot of thoughts that I'm writing down. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If not, don't. Consider subscribing. Thanks for watching. Once again, my name is Danny with the DMGT. I'll catch you next time.